Additional questions and answers that were not addressed in the presentation by Robert Tippett relative to the Star of Bethlehem and the natal chart of Jesus given to the Metropolitan Atlanta Astrological Society, MAAS, on Thursday, October 16th, 2025. I have a question. How do you say the general census of 10 BC was an accurate census when the Bible states, quote, "This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria," from Luke 2:2, according to the NASB. First of all, Luke 2.2, chapter 2, verse 2 must be read as an aside or added information relative to Luke 2:1, stating, quote, "Now in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all the inhabited earth," where that can also be translated as the Roman Empire. 2.1 or chapter 2 verse 1 references the census of the world, which Gerard Gattu listed as taking place in 4 BC. Thus verse 2 addresses that census approved by Caesar Augustus was not the census that was being referred to in verse 2, but another one. That would be another for all Jews spread throughout the Roman Empire, who were male Jews born in Judea, a client country separate from the Empire of Rome as an allied state under a king, Herod the Great, to register in the town of their births. The Greek written that is translated as first is prote or proti, which actually can state before, with Strong's adding King James Version translations, beginning, best, chiefest, firstest of all, former, as well as foremost. Thus Mary, whose remembrances were recorded by Luke, was saying this was the census before the census of the world, as that would happen afterwards when Quirinius was the governor of Syria. This says Mary at 16 was not knowledgeable of who the governor of Syria was when Joseph took her to register in that first census when she gave birth to Jesus. She did not know the name of Saturninus, who was the governor of Syria at that time. Saturninus was the governor of the census before, with Mary knowing the name of Quirinius when the next census, the census of the world ordered by Caesar Augustus, took place, when Mary was 22, and then knowing of the name of the governor of Syria. So hopefully that answers that question. Here is the chart where you can see Mary's age: 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. Before the tax assessment, census of the governor of Syria or Quirinius, the census of the world when the death of Herod took place. So It's ridiculous to think that she's referring to that census, whereas you see the general census, highlighted in yellow, has Saturninus as the governor of Syria, and that's the one that she was 16 and she didn't know anybody's name. And here is an example of the reading. This is an example of overthinking what is written, such the words stated without punctuation, woman without her, man would be nothing, make it appear to state one thing when one's preconceptions lead to make that stated to fit one's views. So people are overthinking what is written here and missing the point of the census of the world not being possible to be when Mary gave birth to Jesus. So she's telling you the truth of before Quirinius was the governor of Syria. So I don't know his name. So that's what you need to read. The census of the world was ordered by Augustus Caesar for all the Roman Empire, including the client country under the client king, Herod. That was the year that Herod issued his last will and testament, leaving power to his brother Archelaus, while he secluded himself in Jericho, preparing to die. He was then thought to die in 4 BC, the year of the census, when Quirinius was the governor of Syria. It would then be impossible for the Magi to meet with him, as the Bible story tells. This is an AI response to Caesar demanding people register in his town and the town of birth. You ask AI, you ask the internet, would Augustus Caesar do that? The answer is written in red. The biblical account in the Gospel of Luke states that Caesar Augustus ordered a census requiring people to travel to their ancestral hometown to be registered. However, historical and logistical challenges to this claim exist. Roman censuses typically required people to register where they lived, and forcing long-distance travel for a census would have been impractical. While Roman censuses were periodic, the specific requirements of one described in Luke are debated by historians. Well, guess what? That should be. This logically says the census requiring males to register in the town of their birth was only for the temple tax that afforded the beautifications of Herod's temple in Jerusalem. This was then imposed on pilgrims that had moved elsewhere in the Roman Empire but returned each year for the festivals. Because Herod was a client king over a client state that was separate from Rome's controlled lands, with Herod deemed king of the Jews by the Roman Senate, Caesar would have approved that tax and supported Herod's order for the census. And here's an example of some stuff that I got from my neuropsychology course, which is a study of the brain functions in psychology. And the text that my professor used pointed out how overthinking was an automatic process of the brain. Thus, a simple word problem can become more complex than it should be because the brain wants to solve problems. In reality, the brain's doing that creates the problems that should not be a problem at all. The words woman without her man will be nothing is not punctuated. However, studies showed that women read these words as saying woman, comma, without her, comma, man would be nothing. And at the same time, males read the words as saying woman, comma, without her man, comma, would be nothing. According to divine syntax, every possible way of reading words can yield truth, which then puts those two views together such that both woman and man are nothing, which leads to God being the essence of both rising from nothing. I hope that answers that question. Here's another question. You say Jesus was 37 years of age when he died. After 3 years of ministry, that says he began his ministry at age 34, I assume, from what you believe. Why does the Bible say, quote, when he began his ministry, Jesus himself was about 30 years old, being, as was commonly held, the son of Joseph, the son of Eli. That's from Luke 3:23, according to the New American Study Bible, NASB. The key to Luke 3:3 is the word about, which is Jose. This also is Mary, the mother of Jesus, relating her story to the physician apostle Luke, which he recorded divinely. No mother goes through natural childbirth without some, unlike some mothers in the 20th century, in the 50s and 60s especially, who were drugged during their deliveries and woke up sometime afterwards not remembering anything. But for the most part, there's not a woman who's gone through childbirth that's not going to know when that child was born. No matter how many they have, they remember those birthdays. In Luke 2:21, it says, quote, at 8 days, end quote, Jesus was circumcised. And Luke 2:25 or 2:25 tells of Joseph and Mary presenting Jesus in the temple to Simeon, when Mary had gone through a period of ritual cleansing as stated by Jewish law. So also in Luke 2:42 it says when Jesus was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast. All of that. There's nothing about that timing as some guesswork being done. This means about is relative to the truth that the age of Jesus was different depending upon the actual known age and the recognized legal age according to when Jesus was first registered as a child born to Joseph. This then relates to the time when Joseph was warned in a dream to take Jesus and Mary and go to Egypt. Jesus would have been registered to the son of Joseph in the census of the world when Mary was 22 in Nazareth, not Bethlehem. That would have been 4 years after he was born, at least 3, if not 4, with the registration documentation listing Jesus erroneously as having been born when he was registered, with that error not corrected. So legally, Jesus was thought to be 30 when he began his ministry, but in reality, he was 34. So I hope that puts some logic to that question. And when Jesus began his ministry, according to, you see Hosea up there at the top, meaning as if or about. It's like guesswork. It's not a clear statement of he was. So that's the truth is he wasn't when they're using that. The truth is it was the law that recognized him as being 30 years registered. And when Jesus began, well, let's see. See what the next question is. How can you justify Jesus being 34 when he began his ministry, other than assuming his mere use of about implies his years in Egypt not counting? Okay, good question. When Jesus began his ministry, the Gospel of John, in John 2, tells of the wedding in Cana, where Jesus going with John, the son of Jesus, with him, as well as Mary and his other relatives that they all went to the temple in Jerusalem with, that they witnessed Jesus overturning tables and declaring, "Take these things away from here, stop making my Father's house a place of business." That's John 2:16, NASB. This led to pilgrims hearing Jesus say, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." John 2:19, NASB. That then led them to say, "It took 46 years to build this temple, and yet you will raise it up in 3 days." That's John 2:20, NASB, which was a statement about Herod's refurbishing project that had then taken 46 years to make it a beautiful building. The timeline produced by Gerard Gertou lists Herod's modification of the Second Temple at the top. And when it had been 46 years, with Jesus born in 9 BC in the 12th year of that beautification project, that means his first Passover was when he was aged 33. He would turn 34 around Pentecost, near his solar birthday, solar return. And that would be when John 3 tells of Nicodemus coming to visit Jesus in Bethany at night, meaning civil twilight allowed for enough light to walk from Jerusalem to Bethany after 6 p.m. So I hope that answers that question. Here's another question. I am confused about how Luke 3:1 and 2 say that John the Baptist began to preach in the wilderness in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. According to Gertou's timeline, that was 29 AD. And 29 AD was the year you say Jesus was crucified. How is that possible? Well, that is a good question to ask. As you can see, it can only make everything become glued together tightly as truth when one realizes the Gospels were written well after the fact, not recorded as history was unfolding. Thus Luke wrote the story of Mary, who was related to Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist. That means Mary was aware of when John, 6 months senior to her son Jesus, began his ministry as planned by God. That means one must be taken away from the calendars that had little to do with the calendars we use today, and there is no uniform concept of how old the world was then and how the world must be recognized in history. From that distant perception of what was then is nothing like today. They didn't look at themselves as we're born before Christ or BC. We're born before the Common Era. They I don't know what they called themselves, what year. I don't even know if they kept track of years, but they recorded a year from the sun reaching the beginning of and the end each year in 360 days, however long. They didn't have an accurate calendar, and it took modification of that calendar to where a month and a half was just like thrown out the window, and it jumped forward to catch up to where it was in reality after they figured some things out astronomically. But this means the 15th year in the reign of Tiberius Caesar must be read as divinely inspired, where the Godhead is fully aware of the known history then and the modern perspective long afterwards. This means the truth of 15th year must be the year 15 as we see it as 15 AD. When you look at that over on the left, you see 15, and you follow to where it's highlighted, it says Tiberius. It would be Tiberius started in the middle of the year 14 as we look back and number them. So he had just completed a year as Caesar in his reign. And you see down the highlighted area down below, that's his 15th year in his reign. Or actually the one below the highlighted area would be his 15th full year. So all of those dates are coinciding with when Jesus was doing his ministry and about to die, about to be crucified. So it's like John the Baptist went before that. He went in Jesus' second year of ministry. So for him, John the Baptist, to begin his ministry, it had to be much earlier when he was 22. So we see that in the second year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. At the end of the first full year as Caesar, that would be when John was 22 and Jesus was still 21, and in the east, headed back to Galilee by that time. This then makes John's ministry last until the second year of Jesus' ministry, when he was beheaded at the age of 34 or 35. So that was a good question, and I hope that answers it. By showing how the natal chart of Jesus you present is relative to the same 2 days, is relatively the same 2 days after he was born, when the Magi reached Jerusalem, why can't there be many others born with the same chart? Well, by golly, there probably were many others born with a similar chart, the same triangle, T-square. So that's a good question to ask, and I call it the Life of Brian perspective, such that Monty Python made humor out of some baby named Brian being born in the stable next to the one where Jesus was born. That's just British comedy. They depicted quite sarcastically what some ordinary man would struggle with, as if Brian would try to create a religious following like Jesus did. A more humane comparison would be that of the prince and the pauper, where one born of poverty at the same place and time as a prince who would become king, so that he would rise to imitate the king, so the king could escape the pressures of being king. In that comparison, it is the birth status that determines how one's natal chart has been projected upon a real life. This is where being the Son of God, not Joseph, makes Jesus rise to greater heights. This is unlike Brian and the pauper, who would pretend to be king. When one remembers the aspectarian that goes along with this birth, the element of the secret plot by Herod to kill many children born in Bethlehem, whose chart would reflect that natal chart, which is unrecorded history, had them end up being destroyed by all these hard aspects. They were born to a difficult life, and they probably died. But you spread this out, the graphic shows there's the same birth date in multiple places, from Baghdad to Alexandria, Egypt to Rome. It shows the same natal chart pattern. And again, it has to be a certain time of day where the sun is elevated in the sky. So it's just like Jesus's. But they were born without divine origin. This means astrology is not a cookie cutter. One thing means the exact same thing for all who have that one thing. This means the divine syntax, that is the language of astrology, requires more than a cookbook analysis for the truth to be found. This is all things hidden from the wise and intelligent. The big brains is that revealed psychically to those babes who receive the spirit of understanding. Because Jesus was of divine origin as the Son of, or as the Christ or the Son of Man, the strong presence of squares and oppositions could well have crushed weaker souls in flesh, and some who were the disciples claimed to be speaking in Jesus' name, who Jesus said, "He who is not against us is with us," could explain some astral twins that were born with the same sense to serve God, and knowing it's going to be a hard life, but they were willing to have God make their lives seem easier. Interestingly, the disciple known as Thomas, and Thomas was not a regular name given to someone because Thomas was Greek meaning twin. It was not really a proper name. It was like a nickname. You're called twin because you were a twin, you're not even called by your real name. And the word in Greek is actually, as reported by John the Beloved, is didymos, meaning twin. And that was not a name parents gave to their children. So Thomas, the disciple, was called the twin for some reason. Possibly he looked like someone or acted like someone in the circle surrounding Jesus. It could be that he looked like Jesus and wanted to be like Jesus. That would have made him an astral twin. And an astral twin is defined as a spiritual counterpart connected through the astral plane, representing a deep, energetic, and telepathic bond that is often easier to access than with other souls. Unlike an intense mirror soul dynamic of twin flames, astral twins share a spiritual connection, but not necessarily the same level of spiritual growth or soul purpose. The term can also be used in the context of astrological twins, which refers to individuals born at the same time and date with nearly identical birth charts, leading to similar personalities, according to Llewellyn. So, that's a good question. There were obviously other people who had a chart like Jesus, but that did not make them Jesus. There's another question. If Gerard Gatou lists a general census in 10 BC, why haven't other scholars likewise seen that as a possibility? Good question. From all the papers that I've read, based on what academia.com offers me, and they offer me something every day, they seem to be focused on astronomical phenomena that is agreed to have taken place. They are then more focused on celestial things like comets, supernovas, and signs in the stars than understanding the holy text of the Bible. And here is a copy of one such paper where all the scholars that see 5 to 6 BC as when Jesus was born are wrong, and that's stated by the one who wrote a paper who's equally wrong, Roger Young, while making the nonsense of a timeline when Herod was dying as when Jesus was born, citing Josephus stating Herod would die soon after a lunar eclipse. That's a red herring. A lunar eclipse is a red herring. Don't even ask a question about the lunar eclipse because it's 4 BC. Herod's not even part of the picture then. That cannot be chased. Not long after I first began my search, after coming to a birth date in 9 BC, which is minus 008 Julian calendar, I found an ancient Christian saint on the internet who professed the birth of Jesus was in 8 BC. And again, I saw that, I'm going, hey, I'm not the only one. However, I did not mark that page, and I have been unable to find who that was to name tonight, but let's just say that all the scholars do not have all the answers, and not all the scholars are known. The old ones are getting buried so that we don't remember them anymore. Now here's another study from a scholar who sees the birth in 6 BC. And he actually mentions the Hebrew month of Elul, where he says that's between September 6th and 7th in 6 BC. Okay, you're getting further back away from 4 BC, but they hadn't got to 9 BC, which converts to 8. because there's no year 0. Here's another question. If John the Baptist was 6 months older than Jesus, did you look at when he would have been born? That's a good question. And yes, I did. By knowing Elizabeth became pregnant prior to Passover in early Nisan, to see her pregnancy beginning around 1 Nisan, 38 weeks, takes John's birth to 1 Tevet, or Teve, which was December 24th, 10 BC, minus 009 Julian calendar. On that day, there was an annular solar eclipse at 11:30 p.m., according to the chart cast, which is Christmas Eve, known as Christmas Eve today, December 24th. The birth chart for this time and date can be looked at as that of John the Baptist. I did search out a relative December 25th birthday in the year of 10 BC, minus 009 Julian calendar, and interestingly, I found that NASA lists an annular solar eclipse that took place on December 24th, according to their timing, at 23:59:49, which is like 11 seconds away from December 25th. And that was at minus 009 Julian calendar in 10 BC. And I ran the data of 11:30 to make a solar eclipse occur exactly on the natal chart. And this is that chart. I think this helps explain the night focus of Christmas, especially those churches that plan a midnight mass on Christmas Eve. It's more evidence that Christmas is more about the birth of John. A solar eclipse was annular, meaning the moon was too far away from the earth to fully block the sun's light. And because it was at the time of the winter solstice, northern hemisphere, the path of the solar eclipse was at the bottom of the world, from the tip of South America to south of Australia, casting a little shadow through Antarctica. This symbolically says John would not be able to block the light of Jesus. And still, John's ministry gained such a following, Herod Antipas was one, that he became the prototype of what a Messiah would be, which Jesus did not fit. John, while imprisoned by Antipas, had his followers ask Jesus if he was the one, as if Jesus would come rescue John from his captivity to prove that. In that way, John, like the moon to the sun, tried to block the light of Jesus, but was unable to do that. This is a graphic of the NASA webpage listing solar eclipses between 999 Julian calendar BC and 0. The annual solar eclipse of December 24th, minus 0009 Julian calendar, is depicted on the world map. That's where it went. And you can see the time and the annular circled. And this is a transit to natal chart for John the Baptist, where it's possible to see his beheading date based on knowing the birth date. Notice the 12th house transits in Virgo, and in the 2nd house, where Scorpio has natal Neptune and Venus, there's transiting Jupiter and Mars are applying as conjunctions to the natal Venus. In the 3rd house, transiting Pluto is late in Scorpio, while the moon has just passed a conjunction with natal Mercury. This says John's chart would be connecting to the spiritual, where God was speaking to him. See, transiting Mercury conjunct the ascendant in the 12th. So this is like those whispers that I was speaking about. They're whispering to John. And Pluto, the transiting sun, has just passed over his natal Pluto in Virgo, in the 12th house. So that's kind of like the reverse of Pluto crossing my sun, where it's like his death was kind of something I think he incited, and when the sun crossed over, it might have highlighted some thoughts he had spiritually, psychically, about death. And transiting Jupiter in the 2nd house is Herod Antipas, the king, and his values in the 2nd house were placed on spiritual enjoyment of listening to John speak in prison. Transiting Mars has a lot to do with sharp objects that cut heads off. Mars is the head. The words of John, which condemned Antipas's relationship with Herodias, his wife, who was the wife of Antipas's brother Philip, Herod II, or Herod Philip I, not Philip the Tetrarch. That painted Herodias as a sinner, and thus Antipas also, for having married his brother's wife. And the transiting moon to the natal Mercury could be a touch of revenge being done through her daughter Salome, and that Venus and Scorpio would be, and again, John wasn't part of that little gathering where she did her dance, but he suffered from it. You said you were led to understand the traditional planetary rulership model. Where did you speak about this topic, and do you still offer this topic in presentation? Thank you for asking that. I spoke to a group of astrologers in Houston, as at that time I was living in Arlington, Texas, and I was spending time waiting for responses to resumes I sent out looking for work by going on AOL, which was the thing of the day, into their astrology chat room. And in that room I met a woman who ran the Houston National Council for Geocosmic Research, NCGR, chapter in Houston, which is an astrology group. And I mentioned, in that chat room that I could speak about this topic, traditional planetary rulership model. She was interested and invited me to come do so. And back then, I had notes on paper, which, they didn't have Zoom. So I had transparencies for charts made at Kinko's, a name from the past. I don't know if anybody remembers that. Which I placed on a projector for a group of about 15 to see projected on a screen. They rented a space in a hotel, a meeting room for that. So they were prepared, and they treated it as something that they wanted to see, and they showed up. The perfection of that model says modern planets have no right to displace a natural ruler. That perfection is so great that another branch of astrological interpretation can be gleaned from that model. Just from looking at the traditional planets, just from looking at those, throw away the outer planets. That's the way astrology was until we started discovering things with a telescope. There is a system of reading the planets according to the traditional planetary rulership. It is perfection. It is God-made. The modern planets give themselves away as pretenses, as if some big brain astrologer came up with the idea to displace traditional planet rulership by something recently discovered. This was a brain, not divine inspiration, which all the lambs followed, which is seen doomed by Uranus being deemed the modern ruler of Aquarius. I don't know if anybody thinks about that, but that's what keyed my thought, because there is nothing about Uranus that fits that assignment, as its volatility is the complete opposite of the stability that is Saturn especially in a fixed sign like Aquarius. That means the modern planets should be associated with the triplices, where Uranus becomes affiliated with the cardinal signs, or maybe it's quadruplices, I get mixed up. But Uranus becomes affiliated with the cardinal signs, Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn, the movers and shakers of the zodiac. That's Uranus. Neptune has a relationship with the mutable signs, Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, Pisces. And that makes Neptune seem like it should be in Pisces. But it just forgets about it being anywhere else. That's just the ridiculousness of a big brain. Big brains miss stuff. Pluto is likewise associated with the fixed signs, Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius. And so that makes Pluto look like it should be right there in Scorpio, just knocking old Mars out of the way. No, that's all wrong. And when I was first led to understand Nostradamus, this is a picture taken of me in 2003, presenting what I found to a group of skeptics. These are card-carrying skeptics in Dallas, Texas. They took the picture, and that's a room that they had rented, and they had a lot of people show up, and half of them weren't Americans. And they did not believe anything about America being founded by Christian values. It's like America was made to be destroyed, is what skeptics think. That if you think one way, they're going to think the opposite. But I stood before them, and it wasn't long after that I became completely destitute and forced to leave Texas, go home to live with my elderly mother in Chamblee, Georgia. And when I loaded my things up in my miniature pickup truck and was leaving Dallas, in my rearview mirror I saw things flying out the back, coming from under the tarp cover littering Interstate 20. So I pulled over, and I went and inspected some of the stuff that was still close to the truck, and found that the top of a box that had my transparencies from that presentation had come open, and my slides were just wanting to remain in Texas. I readjusted the load and made it so that nothing else would fly out. But after Hurricane Katrina destroyed what I still retained, those notes of that presentation were mostly lost forever. I mean, it's like what's retained is in my mind. I don't have anything physical to look at from that presentation. All computers I had were stolen or got so old they stopped working, and hard drives couldn't be found to have anything on them. So it's like, the way of the past is, if you don't have it down to heart and routine, then you're going to forget it. My mind has been so fixed on making Nostradamus known that all of the intricacies that I spoke of then, they don't all come back to me now. In some ways, I see that topic on a deeper level than I saw it then, with what I had been shown still pointing to the perfection of that model. I mean, I see that model as perfect. There is nothing that can be changed from perfection without destroying perfection. And everything that has come to me psychically and spiritually. I do not see me speaking on the topic publicly again. However, I would offer what I can recall to someone who wants to pick up that torch and bear it. On my Nostradamus website, I posted an article about the traditional planetary rulership model, but this is not everything that can be gained from understanding that model. I mean, again, there is a way of utilizing that traditional planetary rulership as a way of interpreting charts as an astrologer. And again, I can't go any deeper than that without trying to reproduce the presentation. And I can't do that, but I'm telling you, it is perfection, and it should be changed. Good question. But here's another one. You said you were led to understand the traditional planetary rulership model. No, I guess I backed up. When your transiting Pluto destroyed your career and turned that to ashes, did you consider turning to astrology to make a living? Okay. Good question. The reality of that answer is when you're unemployed and going deeply into debt, you try everything you can to stay above water. It's just survival mode. Living near Dallas, Texas, which had, and I checked, it still has, a psychic fair every month. I went often to those psychic fairs, and I would, pay $10 and you could see 3 people that sat at different booths and did different things, read tarot cards or held your watch and told you things about yourself, just a psychic fair. And I actually paid one to come to my house and do his work on me. But it was when I was working. It wasn't when I was unemployed, because when I was unemployed I didn't have money to afford to give the psychics or even go to pay $10 for the fair. But I had business cards that I made up that announced me as an astrologer. Didn't say part-time astrologer drives a truck the rest of the time. It said, I'm an astrologer. And I gave them to the man that cut my hair in a salon. He and his wife both did hair in Arlington, Texas, where I lived. And I had a call out of the blue, which is another divine association that I could not see at the time. But a woman who took one of my cards called and asked for a reading. With nothing else to do, I put everything I had into impressing that woman with my astrological abilities. Went overboard. We met at Whole Foods in their reclining area, up at the front of the store. And I gave her an hour-long reading. She paid me $100, which I needed. Then there was no more business like that. However, a year later, she called, identified herself as who I had given a reading to, and she told me she felt it important to tell me that everything I had told her came true, as I had said. She wanted to thank me for my advice, and I asked her if she needed another reading because I needed the money, and she said no. She just felt it was not necessary for her to give me credit for my abilities. So that helped emotionally. But when the world is an expensive place to live, thank yous have no material value. And that was before September 11, 2001, when my life began to turn, and I was put in a different direction of where I needed to go, and being a professional astrologer was not part of that plan. And I went where I was called to go. It was after that I was led to understand Nostradamus that I was learning more and more of what I needed to do in order to understand his prophecies. And that led me to the realization that I had to, and I cried like a baby saying, God, no, don't make me do that. Delve into the French, because I could barely speak English, American English, that Nostradamus wrote. And rather than be dependent on someone else's translation in English, I was told, you need to do it yourself. Put your hands on that French. So relative to that, the internet still was floundering after Y2K, and it did not have a great source of translations. I bought a French to English dictionary, and I had an American English dictionary. At that time, I was basically sold all my furniture and moved out of my house. Or my apartment. I was homeless, sleeping on the sofa at a woman's apartment that I thought was my friend. And I was doing courier work to pay for that right to stay in her apartment, giving her cash every week from what little I was making as a courier. The air conditioner in my pickup truck burned out because I was driving so much and in Texas heat. And when that stopped working, I just simply could not drive after noon. So I would get up early in the morning and I would run these courier deliveries and pickups until noon, and it was just, you know, my tongue was down around my navel like a, you know, dog slobbering because I'm so hot, and there's no wind, there's no air conditioning. It just would, you know, dehydrate me. I couldn't do it. So that created a lot of spare hours in my day, and those spare hours, you know, God's telling me you need to do the French. I'm taking my laptop with the transcriptions I had made of the Nostradamus French with my English dictionary, my French to English dictionary, and going to a local coffee house, which was air conditioned, where I could sit and attempt to translate French into English. I mean, it was as rustic and rudimentary as you can imagine. It was the blind leading the blind, but I was blindly walking where I'd been told to go. And as I did that, I made up a sign that's depicted on the left that said, free readings for fools, all others $5. That was astrology reading or tarot readings for $5. However, the querent would have to pull blindly out of a deck of tarot cards, flip that card over, and get a reading about that card. Because if it wasn't the Fool card, there's their free reading. But if they wanted something more, they'd have to pay $5 for a, you know, for a Celtic Cross reading. And at first I felt like Leakey doing primate studies in the rainforest, sitting there all alone with my books trying to figure out French. People stayed away from me because I was new. Then over time, a few would wander up close enough, you know, to read the sign, kind of like lean in and read the sign before walking away without saying anything. And finally, one day, someone asked, "What does free readings for fools mean?" When I explained, I gave my first reading for $5. And I'm going to tell you that $5 at that time was important. I don't know if you remember it, but once upon a time in them olden days,